In the last section, we saw a very practical example where having a single thread to run our node server, it definitely had some harmful consequences on our ability to service incoming requests. In this section, we're going to continue and start talking about clustering and how it's going to solve this issue. All right, so here's our first diagram of what clustering kind of looks like behind the scenes. When we start to use clustering inside of a node application, we're going to be starting up multiple node processes. There's always going to be one parent process or one kind of like overarching process called the cluster manager. The cluster manager is responsible for monitoring the health of individual instances of our application that we're going to launch at the same time on our computer. So all the stuff that we see right here, these are all instances of our application that are running on our singular computer. These are not being spread out to multiple machines or anything like that. It's multiple instances, one computer. The cluster manager itself doesn't actually execute any application code. So in other words, the cluster manager isn't really responsible for handling incoming requests or fetching data from the database or doing anything like that. Instead, the cluster manager is responsible for monitoring the health of each of these individual instances. So the cluster manager can start instances, it can stop them, it can restart them, it could send them data, it can do other kind of like administrative tasks, essentially. But it's still going to be up to these individual instances of our server to actually process incoming requests and do things like, say, access the database, or handle authentication, or serve up static files, or whatever else we might usually use our node application for. Now, understanding how all this clustering stuff works can be a little bit challenging just by diagrams. So I'm going to show you two very brief diagrams, and then we're going to flip back over to our code editor and start implementing clustering on our TinyExpress application. So these diagrams are just going to give you a taste of what we're going to do. Again, kind of expressing clustering with diagrams can be just a little bit challenging. So let's take a look. Okay, so diagram number 1 right here. This is what happens when you and I usually run a node application from the terminal. So this is not clustering right here, just to be clear. This is what usually happens when we start up our application. You and I run a command at the terminal like node index.js. Node takes the contents of that file, it executes it, it then starts up the event loop. So we get a single node instance out of that entire process. And it's a very linear process. We run the command, node looks at the file, starts up our instance of our application, and that's pretty much it. When we start to use clustering, this entire flow right here changes just a little bit. Okay, so let's see what happens. Let me take out this one right here really quickly. There we go, that's better. Okay, so when we start to use clustering, we're still going to run something like node index.js at the command line. Node is still going to boot up our application by reading the contents of that file and launching a node instance. But here's where things get different. The first instance of node that gets launched when we run that command is what we refer to as the cluster manager. And this is the same cluster manager that we saw in that diagram just 1 second ago. So when we run this command, we get one copy of node, and boom, that is our cluster manager automatically created for us. The cluster manager is then responsible for starting up worker instances. And those worker instances, like what you see right here, are what are actually responsible for processing those incoming requests. To create these worker instances, the cluster manager is going to require in the cluster module from the node standard library. So the cluster module is a standard library module just like FS or HTTP or crypto or any of those other ones. There's one particular function on that cluster module called fork. And whenever we call that fork function from within the cluster manager, something very interesting happens. So when you and I call fork, node internally goes back to our index.js file and it executes it a second time. But it executes it that second time in a slightly different mode. And we're going to see exactly what's different about it. But when it executes that file a second time, that then starts up our worker instance. So in other words, you can basically imagine that our index.js file is going to be getting executed multiple times by node. The very first time, it's going to produce our cluster manager, and then every time after that, it's going to be producing our worker instances. So that's clustering with two very brief diagrams. Let's pause right here. We're going to come back to the next video and we're going to start to actually implement all this clustering stuff in our index.js file. So quick break and I'll see you in just a minute.